Okay, we're going to get started. I'm Max Skelton, the director of the Institute of Regional and International Studies, which is based at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. As most of you know already, IRIS is a research center focusing on politics, security, economics, and development in Iraq. You can access the full recordings of all of these webinar sessions in addition to our research reports through the IRIS website. Today, we are going to be discussing the accountability and judicial process for the usage of violence against protesters starting in October of 2019. The format is follows. First, we're going to begin with an opening question and remarks from each of the panelists. Secondly, we will have the panelists engage with one another with some questions of their own, sort of a conversation across the panel. And then finally, we will open up the floor to you, which can be submitted by way of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have four speakers today. First, we have Danielle Bell, who serves as Chief of the Human Rights Office at the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq. Secondly, Dr. Akhil Abbas, who is currently serving in Baghdad as advisor to Prime Minister Mustafa Kadhimi. We're also joined by Belkis Willi, Senior Researcher at Human Rights Watch. And finally, we are glad to welcome Hassan Wahab. He is the Human Rights Field Program Coordinator at the Iraqi Al-Amal Association. So today we're going to begin with Danielle because actually the original impetus for the webinar was the publication in May of the third UNAMI report on abductions, torture, and enforced disappearances during the protests. So Danielle, if you could please just give us a sense of the findings in the report in terms of both the human rights violations you've documented, and then kind of on the other hand, the accountability and justice side. What steps in the report have you laid out to call upon the Iraqi government to take?
Thank you, Professor Skelton, and good afternoon, everyone, and sincere thanks at the outset to IRIS and the American University Suleimani for the invitation to participate in this incredibly important and timely event. You asked about our work and some of the reports. So monitoring the ongoing demonstrations in Iraq to document and address human rights violations has been a key priority for the UNAMI Human Rights Office. In May, we published our fourth report on demonstrations, which specifically highlights serious concern about abductions, torture, and enforced disappearances, which have taken place in Iraq since the 1st of October last year. Overall, the extent and seriousness of human rights violations documented in this context are unfortunately incredibly disturbing. I'd like to draw your attention to the main findings of our reports. So between the 1st of October last year and late February this year, UNAMI Human Rights Office has documented a pattern of abductions, disappearances, and torture of protesters and activists by unidentified armed actors. And we've also documented a pattern of targeted killings against human rights activists and prominent demonstrators. These violations occurred against a backdrop of threats and intimidation, arbitrary arrests, as well as repression of the media and information, all pointing towards being used as tools to deter participation in the demonstrations and silence protesters. We also documented excessive use of force during demonstrations, including the use of live ammunition and the indiscriminate or otherwise unlawful use of less lethal weapons, which led to the death of almost 500 demonstrators and injured thousands. As I'm sure you saw in the media, there were reports suggesting that more than 20,000 individuals were injured. While the majority of the injuries were minor, often from tear gas inhalation, thousands of Iraqis have suffered from serious to life-threatening injuries. An overall lack of accountability for the violations carried out between October of last year and February of this year is a central theme to all of the reports that we've published in the past couple of months. We're often asked by Iraqi activists Why is UNAMI only publishing reports? Why are you only putting out reports? And I just want to say a couple of words about this. And first of all, the documentation of violations and public reporting is absolutely critical to draw attention to the injustice and the suffering of victims. Our main objectives, however, go well beyond this. On the basis of credible and reliable information, we aim to promote changes in the behavior of the government and other actors towards demonstrators, so that all Iraqis can fully and without fear enjoy their rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. In addition to this preventative focus, our reporting encourages the government to ensure accountability for violations. So these public reports are only one of our many tools. And I can assure you that a lot of work is also happening behind the scenes, which may be unnoticed. For example, we engage regularly with government, and we routinely provide concrete recommendations to government on how to address these violations. Following this engagement, since October, we have seen some changes in behavior. For instance, security forces displayed more restraint and organization in their general policing of the second round of demonstrations last October. Also, the recent arrests of security forces in Basra and Thikar in relation to the deaths of protesters are also encouraging signals, and we hope to see more. Yet, these steps can only be described as piecemeal. Comprehensive investigations and accountability have generally been absent since the onset of demonstrations last year, contributing to a pervasive environment of impunity. I'd like to give you 3 examples where we saw little or no action by government from October until recent months. The judicial investigations for the individuals identified by the report of the investigative committee released last October. We haven't seen concrete actions to address the serious allegations of deliberate killings by the unidentified snipers that we saw between the 1st and the 4th of October last year. We also have not seen the identification concerning the fate and whereabouts of at least 25 missing demonstrators. I would like to conclude on a more positive note. We are extremely encouraged by the new Prime Minister's stated priority to ensure justice and the commitment to move forward on accountability regarding the many dead and injured protesters. We take note of the new government's plans to set up a list committee, which will identify the killed and the injured, both demonstrators and security forces, and provide compensation, as well as the fact-finding committee, which I'm sure Dr. Abbas will discuss. It cannot, however, be stated enough how crucial it is to keep this momentum and ensure that these commitments are translated into results-oriented action in accordance with Iraq's domestic law, as well as the country's obligations under international human rights law. Full accountability and justice, centered on the needs of victims, are key to convince the people that political leaders are sincerely willing to engage in substantial reform and are critical for the prevention of violations, conflict, and violence, as well as the building and sustaining of peace. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Danielle, for that introduction, and we will return again to the details of the report shortly. We now turn to Dr. Akil Abbas from the Prime Minister's office. Dr. Akil, as you know, after the release of the UNAMI report, the government officially acknowledged it and expressed its commitment, and I quote from the Prime Minister's office, to quote, an impartial and independent investigation into all events referred to in the report. I'm hoping you can help us understand what exactly independent investigation will entail. As the UNAMI report states, most victims have not filed criminal complaints with the police or judiciary because they view it to be either futile or even dangerous due to the possibility of reprisals. So given this pervasive distrust, what steps is the government taking to establish a credible, independent process?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matt, for organizing this and for having me within this group. I mean, needless to say, I think a little piece of context here that Iraq is going through, I would say, a difficult and necessary transition from a political order that has shown, deep structural problems governing, government's failures, into one that is would hopefully be more stable and representative of people's hopes and wishes. The protest movement was the manifestation of people's anger with this political system. So we are really within this transition, and part of doing a credible transition towards some sort of stability is accountability, transparency, accountability about the events that happened, the tragic and needless death of Iraqis throughout the protest movement, both demonstrators and security forces. This government is very committed to this, a transparent investigation. And the way it looks at it, it's really a two-step process. The first one is compiling the list that includes really a good bit of information, names, places of death where people were killed, as much information as possible. In this regard, so we were also thinking of including some personal information.
Dr. Akil, could you, we're getting some feedback on your voice. Could you move the mic a little bit closer to you or adjust it a bit?
Okay. Is that helpful? Should I just speak directly to the thing or put something else? Or would this do it? Just tell me, I'll do whatever works.
Okay, try that.
This one?
Perhaps.
Okay. Sorry, I just thought it'd be savvy a bit. But...
Yeah, that sounds better.
Okay, is this better?
But we lost your camera. There you go. Yeah, but that's
okay.
Much...
Okay. Yes, providing as much information as possible, and the process has begun. The importance of this process is two things. The first part of this process, first of all, establishing a list. The government recognizing, acknowledging that this number of people were killed throughout the protest movement. Okay, this is very important. So far, there is no official documentation or recognition of all of this. There are bits and pieces, issued by official statements, the previous government, but really we don't have one compiled list specifying the number, so on and so forth. We have done quite a bit in compiling this list. We've received various lists from human rights organizations, both domestic and international, lists from activists, but also lists from government sources. And we're going through cross-checking names, so to eliminate repeats, verifying, and sometimes we're even checking with hospitals, forensic centers throughout the country. The hope was that the list would be compiled in a few weeks' time, but the coronavirus, the closing of government offices really complicated this. So we needed more time. I would say that so much of this work is done. It is yet to be finalized. Now, when the list is out, we consider this an important step. First, because of acknowledgement and recognition, this is very important. And the second thing is that the hope also that this will create a momentum, that it is some sort of a bridge into the second step. The second step is the fact-finding commission. There are several ideas that have been circulated within the Prime Minister's office. We've written some of those down. And I don't want to get into details. I'm not authorized to reveal much about this, but I would say a few things about this commission, this committee, whatever you want to call it, is that, first of all, this would be, the thinking is that this would be a small committee, okay? It is not a judicial committee, it is a government committee. Okay? This is one. The second thing is that it would include Iraqi former judges, people who worked on these sorts of issues, legal experts, and some people from let's say activists. Okay, there will be hopefully some international expertise there, some advisory role. Okay, this is one of the ideas that we're circulating, and there is an interest in it. Also, the committee would benefit from previous work. We're not starting necessarily everything from scratch. There was previous work by the committee established by the previous government. I didn't read the full report. They had a long report that was not released to the media, an original one that's tens of pages. Colleagues who have read it, whose judgment I trust, said that it was a credible report. What came out was a shortened version that caused lots of controversy because it wasn't convincing to lots of people. So I think some of that work, the original work, would be revisited. So much of this is work in progress. Our main priority now is to finalize the list and have it out. Having said all of this, the Prime Minister has come out publicly expressing his commitment to this. His private announcements really reveal the determination that you see in some of the statements, the public statements that we made out. This is very important for this government, for legal reasons, for moral reasons, for political reasons. And we're committed to it, and hopefully something that is transparent, credible, and meaningful will come out of all of this.
Thank you, Dr. Akil. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, both from the panel and from the Q&A to follow up, but thank you for that introduction. Belkis, you've heard at least the preliminary answer from Dr. Akil on the framework going forward. I'm wondering if you can comment on what Human Rights Watch generally, and you specifically, would regard as a credible accountability process. So what potential gaps do you see in the government's stated approach, when considering kind of a broader human rights framework?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address that, and thank you, fellow panelists, for discussing this important issue. I think the first thing that we need to do when answering your question is really situate these abuses in a broader context in Iraq, because we can't treat the abuses that we saw on the streets during these protests as isolated or unique or different from the pattern of behavior from the past. And therefore, when trying to address these abuses, one really has to look at solutions that are going to address the broader problems. First, to talk about the issue of enforced disappearance. As was mentioned, there were protesters taken off the streets and enforcibly disappeared. Their parents asked for information and could not find it from the government as to their whereabouts. That has been an issue in Iraq for decades. According to the International Center for Missing Persons, Iraq has at least 250,000 missing people, up to 1 million. According to the ICRC, it has one of the highest rates of missing in the world. And recently, I think really since 2014, we've unfortunately seen that counterterrorism operations have led to a dramatic spike in the numbers of people who have been picked up by a range of different forces and then disappeared, unfortunately, some still to this day. We saw that particularly in the operation to retake Fallujah, but we saw this across the counterterrorism operations. So that unfortunately is not unique. Arbitrary arrest, which is very much tied to this issue, is another thing that we've seen for many, many years. And I can tell you as Human Rights Watch, we have been asking the government for at least the 4.5 years that I have been in country for a list of the specific forces within the government structure that have the legal mandate to detain. The government cannot seem to answer that question to me. Does the National Security Service have the right to detain? Do PMF forces have the right to detain? Does the federal police have the right to detain? The fact that we don't have an answer to that is what's leading to the problem. In addition, we've asked the government over and over to provide the public with information on the number of official places of detention and their broad location. At the very least, there should be a number that's put out to the public, but we have absolutely no idea how many places of detention are in Iraq that are considered official. And finally, a systemic problem with this, with the issue of arrest, is the fact that no forces in Iraq give notifications of arrest when they arrest someone. So the family has no idea when someone has been picked up, who has taken them, for what reason, and where to. And that's why we've been advocating for a long time with the Ministry of Interior and others that forces have to give notifications of arrest to minimize the risk of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance. Now, killings obviously is something that we saw in the context of the protests, but again, Iraqi security forces have been extrajudicially killing people for many, many years, and the key problem has been impunity. For the many years that Human Rights Watch has been documenting extrajudicial killings, we have yet to see a single instance where a commander is held properly accountable in a transparent manner for an extrajudicial killing. And in fact, these abuses continue because of that complete impunity. Then we have a real lack of space for free expression that includes free speech, but also free assembly. That's why we saw an approach to crack down on protesters even when they were peaceful. And that is unfortunately a space that really has been closing with time. And the government has actually utilized not only force on the street, so armed security forces, to minimize space for free expression, but it's also been using its own laws. The Penal Code, which is dated from 1969, includes many, many provisions that are vaguely worded that allow government officials to bring spurious legal suits, provisions around defamation and incitement. And we see them doing this as a way of simply shutting down criticism and free speech. And finally, attacks on journalists is another thing. We saw this in the context of the protests, but this is not new. There's a reason that for so many years, organizations that track this rate Iraq as one of the worst and most dangerous places in the world to be as a journalist. Just to wrap up on the question of accountability for abuses in the context of this last wave of protests, there is the immediate need for trials, judicial mechanisms, and there it's really going to be about chain of command. How far up do the prosecutions go? Do they actually get at those who gave orders to shoot live fire on peaceful protesters? Or do we simply see low-level individuals within the security forces that were following orders to a large extent being the ones that get punished? And if that approach is taken, we're not going to see an improvement, I believe, in addressing accountability and long-term change. Then, of course, compensation is something that the families have been asking for a long time. And unfortunately, some of them have been waiting since October. At this point, it really is crucial to ensure that. And finally, it's a question about security sector reform. How do we put changes in place into the system so that this does not happen again? We heard from the former Prime Minister that he said that security forces should not use live fire on protesters, and yet they did again and again and again. And the real question is, how do we stop that from happening again?
Thank you, Belkis. I think when we get to the Q&A, we're going to return to this question of accountability and the specific steps forward, but thank you for laying those out, and as well as giving us some broader context, because of course it is important to understand that this is not an exceptional set of events, and there is a history and a kind of structural issue at play here. So thank you for that. Hassan, your organization, the Iraq Al-Amal organization, has done a lot to document human rights abuses, and you work with closely with civil society activists across the country. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of how civil society regards the new government's approach to the accountability process. And what changes do you think need to be made to that framework?
I thank you, Mr. Mack. Well, actually, we've been working with other NGOs and activists, demonstrators, leaders to document all violations and abuses taking place by the government during the recent demonstrations since early October. And we've been documenting many cases of abductions, enforced disappearance, smear campaigns against activists and demonstrators, leaders, and accusation of espionage. We've been trying to offer a kind of reliable, independent information for the international community, and for not only for a national level for the government, but we've been working on international level as well with other NGOs. We collect 100 signature to call upon the government to start start investigation and push forward the Human Rights Council to call the Human Rights Council member states to conduct a special session for Iraq. Also, these kinds of effort and collaborative effort with the international agencies in terms of documenting all the abuses to offer these documented transparent information. We've been watching recently the program of the Academy, and we've been listening to the press statements, and the mentioning of the investigations and accountability and justice in his speech. We've been noticing, some kind of collaboration in terms of releasing detainees, being in charge of cases related to freedom of expression. But we still, have our reservation about those statements, because we don't look for statements, press statements only. We usually looking for serious action, serious concrete action in terms of accomplish the accountability and justice and bring perpetrator to justice. Until now, we haven't been seeing those perpetrators, identified, those who have giving the orders to police chief in the provinces to use the excessive use of force against demonstrators, to use the live fire against demonstrators. We didn't find tangible changes that satisfied all demonstrators on the ground. The lack of seriousness from the government resulted to new abuses against demonstrators. You witnesses all, I guess, during the previous week that we had lots of cases in the southern governorate, especially like Basra, Najaf, Diwania. There's another wave of abuses against demonstrators. The security forces still use the live fire against them. We have injuries. We as civil society organizations is still demanding, and it's a continuous call for us that the necessity of accountability and justice, and to withdraw all the spurious cases against activists and demonstrators, leaders, that and in addition to the charges related to terrorism against those young activists. So it's not about only, the cases related to demonstrations and public properties, while you have another different, you have tens of cases against young leaders who they are going to lose their futures based on spurious cases. Another issue I would like to raise is the martyrs and death certificates for those martyrs, those being killed by riots. When they go to the hospitals, dead people, and try to issue a death certificate, imagine that in the hospital, the death reasons will be street fights or a clan's conflict or car accidents. So in this regards, how the government are going to deal with this issue, how going to engage those martyrs and the families of them and the victims in the compensation system. Another issue we would like to focus that the restrictions of weapon and the speech about the third parties. When we are going to identify, and the government will have the courage to identify the third parties, to hold snipers and who's giving the snipers the order accountables. When we are going to have independent, impartial investigation committee that have include a representation from civil society organizations, from the victims of violence as well in this committee. We don't want the scenario of abuses and the use of excessive force against protests to continue. And it's still and continue, as you all witnesses during the Al-Kadhimi governor. And also, despite he was promising that he's going to stop all kind of use of force against protests. So it's continue on a daily basis, and we have many evidence, and we've been documenting and continue to document these cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hassan, and thank you for all the work that you are doing to continue to document these cases, both past cases and going forward, because as we know, this is an ongoing issue. Let's now turn to a kind of section in which we will ask some questions across the panel. After that, after we've done that for about 20 minutes, we'll turn to the Q&A from the audience. Balkis, I'm wondering if you have a question for the panel.
Yes, I do. And Dr. Abbas, I hope it's okay to put the first question to you. First of all, thank you so much for presenting on the plan of the government and of the Prime Minister's office in particular. And I appreciate that, as you said, it's early days. So there are different proposals being floated around. So there might not be much clarity yet. But I guess I was curious of several things. One is something that I've come across in my work in Iraq, particularly in my discussions with judges over the years, where over and over again, when we talk about abuses of security forces, they say to me that though they do have a sense of who higher up within the chain of command is responsible, they do not feel that they have the ability to pursue charges because of the political realities in Iraq. And I'm curious whether you think that what stopped judges in the past can be overcome at this point in time. And I ask that because I wonder whether the thinking of the Prime Minister in creating this fact-finding mission is specifically for that reason, to remove all of the pressure being on judicial authorities, but instead to also show that there's level government interest in investigating the abuses separate to the judicial process. And I wonder whether you have thoughts on how these two would work together. How would the work of the fact-finding mission feed into the judicial process, or would they try to be kept separate for reasons of process and impartiality? And finally, I wonder whether you have any thoughts, whether from the Prime Minister himself, broadly from his office or the government, on how it views the appropriate way that the state should be dealing with those at the highest levels of command who disobeyed orders or called for orders that were illegal, versus those who are lower level, who committed abuses, yes, but were doing so under orders and were not sort of up the chain of command.
Thank you. So should I answer, or would we just have all the questions and then?
If this question is directed towards you, but after you give your answer, others might have some thoughts as well.
So I should. Okay. I mean, first of all, I mean, this government is 40 days old. Okay, less than 2 months, and for us, we consider this government 10 days old. When it was, you know, the cabinet was. I mean, that the other portfolios were filled. It took so much time, just this political aspect. So busy with lots of other things. Now, there was lots of discussion which way we should go about the fact-finding commission. So, and we thought, you know, the mandate of this government is a year to a year and a half. We're not sure. This is something we can manage. And once we have the finalized list, hopefully the momentum, there is a determination to have the committee, you know, formed, completed, doing its work. We don't know how long it will take. And then after that, so this is the government work, this particular government. And then after that, then it would be submitted to the judiciary. I mean, it is the judiciary that decides what to do. But the commitment that we have, the interest that we have, the obligation that we have is to go as far as it takes, unveil facts, compensate victims, acknowledge what happened. Now, part of your question is political, okay? Do I have an answer for it? No, I don't. We weren't born yesterday. Politics play even in the most mature democracies, but we're trying to protect the process as much as possible for this government. I don't need to, give you, any context about Iraq's status of fragile institutions. But what I can speak for is the determination to go as far as possible for this government in carrying out this process. It is very important for this government to have a meaningful, credible, and transparent process.
Belkis, did that answer your question, or did you have any follow-up on that?
No, that was very helpful, and thank you for being so frank. I totally appreciate that. As you said, it's a very young government with many challenges that it's facing.
Yeah, but I think this question of the relationship between the fact-finding commission and the formal judicial mechanisms, and the capacity of judges to pursue charges, is something that needs to be clarified going forward, Dr. Akil. I know right now it's kind of early days, but this connection between the judiciary and the government's process is a big issue of ambiguity for a lot of activists, from what I'm hearing.
I mean, one thing at a time. Let's get there. One thing at a time. Thank you.
Let's turn to Hassan.
Yes.
Do you have a question for the panel?
Yes. Actually, our perception as local NGOs that the international human rights agencies are not doing enough to push for accountability and justice. I'm talking about international level. So my question will be to my colleague Danielle, how they can increase their efforts for lobbying upon Iraqi government to start impartial investigations, taking into consideration the government usually, giving a high priority to voices coming from international level, the voices coming from outside. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Hassan, for the question. And I'm happy that you asked the question, because we can always do more. So at the outset, I would like to reassure you and everyone listening on this call that accountability and continuing our work with the government of Iraq remains a priority, both of our work of the UNAMI Human Rights Office in Iraq, as well as the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights. So I had mentioned in my presentation that a lot of the work that we're doing isn't seen by the public eye. So for example, we're working closely with the government. We share a lot of information with them confidentially because you've seen the sensitive level or nature of information that we're putting in the public domain. That information is backed by realms of fact-finding, sensitive information, things that can't be released to the public. This dialogue we have an engagement, confidential, that's ongoing with the government. At the same time, we work very closely with the international human rights mechanisms. So that would include the work that we do also with you on Universal Periodic Review, as well as working with some of the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, as well as some of the treaty bodies. So accountability, and as you've seen in the new UNAMI mandate, remains a piece of the work that we'll be doing this year and in the years to come. So I can assure you we will be continuing. Thanks so much for the question.
I'm wondering, Belkis, if you have any thoughts on that, because I've seen you comment several times, at least in news articles, around the limits that international judicial bodies have in relation to Iraq, which is sort of another angle in terms of the international community's role. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Sure. I mean, something that protesters have very frequently asked me about in my role as the Human Rights Watch representative is the extent to which they would be able to try to invoke the role of international bodies. They often cite things like the International Criminal Court as a way of ensuring that if judicial mechanisms in Iraq fall short, there is a way for people to be held accountable. Unfortunately, Iraq is not a party to the Rome Statute, so the International Criminal Court isn't really the right way forward or the right mechanism. As Danielle cited, of course, there are a range of systems within the UN that can take complaints of various kinds, including where there are cases of torture and forced disappearance, like that. But I think there is a broader question about the role of the international community. The international community is quite visible in Baghdad. I mean, they take up a large portion of the city with their large embassies and huge budgets in some cases to be supporting projects and work in Iraq. And I think, a question that I have on my mind is what can these embassies with representation in Baghdad be doing to ensure that Iraq is held to its promises when it comes to specific accountability for these abuses? And how does that feature into things like the ongoing US strategic dialogue right now and other fora? But the other question is broader than that. What can the international community do to help a government, a very willing government, it seems, to put in place the right protections to ensure that human rights activists, journalists, protesters are safe on the streets, and to ensure that the type of security sector reform that we need to see so that these kind of abuses can happen again with impunity actually do happen. And I'd love to hear, Danielle, if you have any thoughts from the perspective of the Human Rights Office at UNAMI, how you would like to see the international community engaging on accountability efforts more broadly.
Danielle, I'll turn to you on that.
No, and thanks, Belkis, for the question and making the incredibly important and relevant points. At the outset, accountability for these violations, and as I'd like to also come back to Belkis's presentation at the very beginning, where she highlighted that the violations that were documented in the context of the demonstration since October are only one piece in a broader context of violations that have been ongoing in Iraq for many, many years. And so it's, as Dr. Abbas said, it's no small feat to address these. And accountability for these violations primarily lies with the government. But as Belkis said, which I agree with completely, there's a very significant role that must be played by the international community and of course by the United Nations. For example, public advocacy as well as ongoing engagement by member states and all member states that have a role and presence in Iraq regularly with the government, and keeping human rights discussions and the importance of accountability and prevention at the forefront of discussions, and the recognition that accountability and prevention, accountability is absolutely critical for building long-term stability and peace. It is not, we will not see sustainable peace in Iraq until these long-standing violations have been addressed. In terms of being a bit more concrete, some of the things that could be quite useful in and this is where I would also want to hear from Dr. Abbas. Where do you see the key role of the international community in UN in terms of providing support to the government? Do you see it as being more technical training, support, funding, or do you see it as being more useful to have public engagement and advocacy? So passing it over.
Okay, so it's my role. It's my turn now.
Yeah, well, your turn to Danielle's question around
The international, yeah.
is the role of the international community in relation to the government's process.
Yeah, I mean, I will deal with this in the narrow sense of the fact-finding commission. I think the way we're looking at this is something to give credibility, the presence of some sort of international advisory role individuals, but also to provide technical help throughout the process. I'm giving a technical answer to the question, not it's an answer that deals with education and so on and so forth. Of course, there is room for this, but in the context of this committee, the role would be advisory. And I think that also plays into some sort of credibility, but also remember that Iraq's political context is very sensitive, to the presence of the international community, in government work. So this has also to be taken into consideration. Thank you.
Dr. Kill, I'm wondering if you could clarify one point. Earlier, you said that the fact-finding commission might include various kinds of international actors. Can you provide a little more detail around what the thinking there?
I mean, no government actors, no foreign government actors, of course, but some sort of civil society or some sort of human rights organizations. We're still thinking about this, but certainly no government, no, say, international organizations such as, I would say, the UN, or I think official representation would raise questions and might put hurdles in the long run, but some sort of human, some sort of advisory role from more experienced human rights organizations, legal organizations that deal with these sorts of transitions, might be helpful. That's the thinking right now.
So is the distinction, in a sense, between a international, in a sense, quasi-governmental body like the UN versus a body like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, which is a human rights organization but independent and whatnot? Is that the distinction?
Yes, I would. Yes, it's closer to this. Yes, no international official entities. Because this could complicate things in Iraq, politically speaking.
And Belkis, I wonder if you wanted to follow up there on that particular question.
Well, I was interested also in the reference that you made, and I think that it could actually really help to have international expertise You mentioned, of course, on the credibility side, but I also think, going back to the point I made about the political realities of Iraq, there is going to be an incredible amount of pressure on Iraqi members of such a fact-finding committee or commission. And in fact, we've seen that. I remember very well speaking to members of the committee that was set up to investigate the disappearances after Fallujah. And I spoke to a committee member about 6 months afterwards who said to me, you know, yes, we have some findings, but no, we'll never be able to come out with them publicly because we can't for political reasons. And so, you know, the role of internationals might be able to sort of help diminish a bit of the pressure on Iraqis. And there, I wonder whether the government is looking at some very, I think, powerful and interesting examples, particularly in the region. I don't know if you've been looking at the example in Bahrain, where a commission was brought in with international, incredibly eminent experts who came in an independent capacity, so not linked to specific governments, and were able to provide their expertise and ultimately came out with a powerful report with many important recommendations. And I wonder whether that model might be something that the government would be considering pursuing.
I mean, just to answer this, the Bahrain model was brought up, but I think it was a lot more encompassing. It took lots of time. I mean, we're talking about a government that, you know, whose mandate's probably a year to a year and a half. There were different things that were discussed, different models. And I think at the end, we will have to come up with something that fits Iraq, you know, at the current moment, or the moment where this, you know, comes to pass, where we have to act on it. So still, this is work in progress. Nothing is final.
So we're now going to turn to some questions from the audience, and panelists can continue to sort of direct questions to one another as well. But I want to include some of these, and I'm going to kind of group some of them together. I've received several questions, both from some of our diplomatic colleagues and journalists around basically, you know, the ongoing aspect of this. You know, are there any efforts underway to ensure that the types of abuses witnessed during the previous wave of protests don't materialize again in future protests? And so, and within that, are there certain elements that might be easier to tackle than others? And as you know, the way that the investigation has been framed, at least from the government statements, it's been more or less kind of time bound within a certain period. And so this also raises the question of to what degree is there a relationship between abuses that happened within a certain time frame and going forward, you know, with similar kinds of things. So I'd actually like to hear both from kind of the human rights perspective, as well as from the government on this, because I think both are valuable. But we'll start with Dr. Akil.
I mean, this has to be situated within the larger framework of security structure, you know, security sector reform. We realize there is a lot of work to be done. You know, we realize that you will need to have structural, institutional deterrences in order for, you know, these abuses, the violations, you know, the abuses of power, in order for them not to happen in the future. How can you do this in 40 days? I think that's very, you're asking us to come up with a miracle. The issue about abuse of power, that we don't want to see, you know, a repeat of these abuses, violations, so on and so forth, are among the constant themes that the Prime Minister actually brings up when he talks to the security people, his visit to the you know, Minister of the Interior, the Minister of Defense. But of course, you know, saying things does not mean that these things will happen. This requires a different process, a government probably that is more stable, that has a mandate. You know, we're talking about a government that is not represented in the parliament, a government that doesn't have institutional, political base, so on and so forth. So we have to acknowledge the limits. Yes, there are hopes, but I think some of these are long-term issues that one realistically should not hope for significant changes within this very short period of time. Frustrating, but that's the reality.
So one of the follow-up, but I also want to get Hassan's perspective on this. But before I turn to Hassan, one quick follow-up question is that that has come up in the Q&A here, is that there is a kind of sense that the prime minister, coming from a security background, knowing the security institutions well, connected across them, can actually have the kind of capacity relationally and institutionally to ensure that some of these ongoing abuses are dealt with. Is there a sentiment within the government that Kadhimi, due to his background, might be able to work with the security institutions to ensure that there is, at least in the short term, a reduction of this kind of violence? Because we've even seen it in the last few days, frankly. And so it's the expectation is that Kadhimi might be able to use his leverage due to his background. What do you think?
Okay, this question is to me.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean the prime minister, I think, gave an order to security forces not to shoot at protesters. That was early on, and I think it was reinforced once or twice. There are lots of political things to work on in Iraq. The coronavirus, the financial crisis, so on and so forth. So realistically speaking, you have to, you have a certain amount of political capital, a certain amount of political energy that you have to use, and you have to prioritize. This is something that has been talked about, discussed. I think the Prime Minister feels he has a good understanding of the security sector in Iraq. We're working on certain reforms within what is possible for us. But again, expecting a complete overhaul or a semi-overhaul in such a short period of time is not realistic. And I would say even not within the mandate of this government, but the time mandate. I mean, this is the reality, but some reforms will be instituted for sure.
So reading between the lines there, Dr. Akil, and I'll turn to Hassan on this, it would seem that there is a real sense within the government's internal discourse of limitations as to what can be done and what cannot be done. On the other hand, Hassan, I would gather that in the just in your opening remarks, that on the other hand, among civil society activists, there's a real expectation that the government will actually go a bit further, that there won't be this kind of very limited mandate. How do you, Hassan, reconcile this kind of limitations that Dr. Akil is referring to with the expectations that civil society has for the process?
Thank you, Mark. Well, actually, I would speak on, in the perspective of demonstrators themselves, since we are very close from them as a monitors for the violations, doing regular meetings with demonstrators leaders. So, we are much more aware about what's going on the field. From the demonstrators' perspective, that the government's still not serious. So this is number one. In the things of accountability and justice, and human rights for the government still not a priority. The government used the coronavirus as a justification to slow up the process of accountability and the committee of the investigation committee. Still, for now and for decades, for all the governments, You know, whenever they start, they says when it comes to human rights, they need long-term, you know, strategic programs and planning. When it comes to human rights, it's nothing easy to change. It needs lots of efforts and timing. Now, for the government, we agreed that the economic crisis is a priority. The militias situation, and, you know, controlling weapons. Also, the negotiation with the U.S. About their presence in Iraq. Still, also, you know, things related to to the economic campaign salaries for the employees, the governmental employees. This is, you know, a whole, and there is lots of issues in the list of the priorities. And if you examine the list, you will find human rights on the bottom. Still, we need to push far, you know, push a step further, human rights to become on the top priorities for the government. We have been noticing that recently the demonstrations being escalated. Why? You know, did Mr. Aqil wondered why the demonstrators become, you know, to escalate their demand, and they start demonstrating and, you know, gathering and have a united demands again? So if you take the example of Basra, then you will find the major demand is to change the perpetrators. In Basra, the chief of Al-Sadma forces. If you go to Nasiriyah, also you will see that the main demonstrators' demand was to achieve justice for the case of Jamil al-Shimari, because there is you know, a judicial decision against Jamil al-Shimari, but yet from the judge in Nasiriyah, but it's not active, and the government doesn't consider this to implement and arrest you know, those perpetrators. So the government trying to send positive messages, but at the meantime, it's not considered as positive as it, but considered as frustrating and disappointed messages by, you know, reallocating the security leaders whom responsible for violence against demonstrators. So they're trying to, you know, repositioning the places, you know, instead of, you know, sending them from from Babylon to other cities. And this is not a solution. So the demonstrators, you know, smart enough to consider that, you know, the government still don't want to make a serious change by, you know, putting those perpetrators and bringing them to justice. So the serious action is to bring those perpetrators, which really well known to the all community, and we have evidence. You know, we have witnesses, videotapes. You know, lots of evidence. If it's presented to the court, then the process can, you know, move smoothly for justice. Why all the cases? Why all the cases of victims being, you know, registered and filed by the family victims in Babylon and Diwaniyah still, you know, suspended with no further action against the you know, police or riots leaders? So all these kinds of, yes.
I think you're raising an important point about these, in addition to others that you've made, about these provincial judicial bodies. You mentioned in Basra and in Nasiriyah these charges. I was reading earlier that in Thiqar, that there were arrest warrants to, quote unquote, all the officers involved in violence against protesters, and there were something like 15 arrest warrants. And I'm wondering, both from your perspective as well as from perhaps Belkis and Danielle, what role you see from these provincial judicial bodies? Because we think of judiciary in Iraq is, I think, poorly understood, and how the different elements relate to each other. Have you seen these kinds of cases go forward, you know, in an effective way in the past? Is this an avenue that families can take? And that's to anyone. That's Belkis, Hassan, Danielle.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe can I jump in?
Sure.
One of the that's a really good question, is to what extent can the provincial judicial mechanisms be used as a means of accountability and for victims to seek justice and accountability at the governorate level? It's extremely difficult without the political cover and without the political will from the highest levels. So to answer concretely, how many cases have we seen? Well, you heard in my presentation that we saw some arrests. We have seen arrests in Basra and Thikar in the past couple of days. But prior to that, we had only seen arrests in maybe 2 or 3 different cases, whereas with the vast majority of the killings and the violations, we didn't see any arrests. If I can just take this opportunity just to say a couple of words about from the previous round of questions, if that's okay. One of the questions is, you know, to what extent can the government be expected to take concrete actions to prevent violence in the next rounds of demonstrations? What can be done? And I just want to kind of respectfully say that it's not that hard. For example, what are the most common violations that we have seen in the previous demonstrations? Excessive use of lethal force, indiscriminate or unlawful use of less lethal means, illegal arrests and detention, and repression on rights to freedom of expression in terms of shutting down of the internet, etc. If you look at the first protests in the first week of October, on the first day, in the first few hours, live ammunition was used. There were water cannons, stun grenades before the protesters even got to Tahrir Square. The activist community, with organizations like Human Rights Watch, Hassan's organization, us, IHCHR, did a ton of reporting and advocacy in advance of the second stage of demonstrations. And what happened when they started on October 24th? We saw a complete and utter difference and improvement in the conduct of security forces. We saw no use of live ammunition in Tahrir Square in the first days of the second wave. We saw it later on in sporadic incidents, but the protesters were allowed to gather. And so I just want to point out that so if there is some effective command and control, and there is political will at the highest levels, giving concrete instruction to the security forces on the ground on their conduct will have an immediate impact on the safety and the protection of demonstrators. And if I could just kind of throw a question in the box, is with the commitment that we've seen from the government toward protection of protesters and accountability, I'd like to ask Hassan, who has a network of activists all over the country, as well as Belkis, who works with journalists all over the country, including Kurdistan, to what extent have you seen improvements in the exercise of the right to freedom of expression? For example, demonstrators or activists talking about accountability, or talking about disagreeing with the government on whatever issue. Have you seen an improvement, and how have things changed? If I can just put that question out there to link it. Thanks.
Thank you, Danielle. Belkis and Hassan?
Yes. So, well, actually, thank you for the question, Danielle. For all the activists and us as NGOs, all demonstrators, it's not about improvement, in the rights of expression. The thing is, there is always a limit. So it's about, accomplish the demands of the demonstrators. So it's not about giving the opportunity for people to have the right to express. Okay, so they express their demands, they've been demonstrating for months, but what about the results? So it's about achieving. It's about looking for tangible, tangible impact from the government, a tangible reaction for the demands of demonstrators. Why the demonstrators still demonstrating until now, why they are trying to escalate it, why they are trying now, maybe I haven't mentioned that they are trying to convert into a new tactics, is to use the social media as a new tool for demonstrating, because they found no results, and maybe they found the abuse from the security forces, so they are going to use a new tactic using the social media, but there is always a limitation for this kind of intervention from the government to respond to the demands raised by the demonstrators. So it's always, a kind of certain things you have to ask for, but when it comes to the government themselves, when it comes to their interest, no, they can do whatever to stop you from going ahead.
Thank you, Hassan. And with that, I'm going to turn to our final comments from each of the speakers. And just before we begin that, I hope everyone will know that we plan to take up this topic again in follow-up conversations and webinars. So please know that this is going to be a long process, and we will continue to follow it going forward. So Dr. Akil, we'll start with you. Just a final comment.
Okay, well, this is a difficult situation, tragic situation. Iraq is supposedly a democracy. I think this is widely acknowledged, the supposedly. And the state hasn't met expectations of what it means to be democratic. I think we all acknowledge this, and the protest movement is one example of this. The atrocities that happened, the unjustified use of violence against peaceful protesters. These are all, sad realities, realities that have to come to an end. And the only way for these to come to an end is by having strong institutions and a state that is transparent, that is interested actually in setting up these realities that lead to a meaningful democracy. We're not there. This is part of a transition. So I think managing expectations here is realistic without losing view of the final goal. The current status is not acceptable to many of us, but there is hope, there is determination, and this takes lots of effort, this takes lots of sacrifice, and we should keep moving ahead with these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Akil, and we will continue to follow up with you in the office on this issue. Hassan, final comment from you.
Yes, thank you, Mac. Well, I think it's time. It's the real time. It's the good time for the government to prove that they are, coming with a new agenda that respects human rights. It's a great opportunity for government, for academic government, to show that they are really respecting the freedom of expression. They are respecting their commitments for the international human rights conventions that the Iraqi already signed. And if he's not going to, respect his promises, for sure, this it's happened, and the power will not remain for people, forever. So this is a great opportunity. We will advise to invest and use.
Thank you, Hassan. Belkis.
Thank you. Just on the question Danielle raised about freedom of expression, and I touched on quickly in my comments before, we've released a new report that just came out tracking freedom of expression, particularly freedom of speech in Iraq, and looking at the continued way in which mostly government officials are misusing and abusing the penal code, to go after speech they don't like. This is also a significant problem in the Kurdistan region. We've seen it coming up more and more in the context of COVID and journalists and media trying to put out very important information that can help public health on the virus. And there, for the new prime minister, what we really need to see in terms of a show that this is an important issue to him and his government is that they propose legislation to reform those provisions of the penal code that are problematic, but also that they end pushing things like the very problematic cybercrimes bill that has been tried to be pushed through parliament, and a very problematic freedom of expression and assembly bill. And finally, a very quick round of things that I think it is feasible to ask the government to be moving on within their potentially short term in office. One, immediately make all forces that have the legal right to arrest have to issue notifications of arrest. Two, make public a list of all forces that have a legal mandate to arrest so the public knows who can arrest you and who can't. Third, to make public information on the official places of detention. How many are there? Ideally put out a number of how many people are in prison. That's something that we've been waiting for many, many years, and no Iraqi that I've ever spoken to knows the answer to. And finally, because torture is a big problem, was something that was raised by protesters who were arrested, push for a proposal that the parliament ratifies the optional protocol on the Convention Against Torture. And even until that happens, even if the parliament is lagging, the government could already create a national prevention mechanism. This would be a body that would monitor torture in prison facilities and take action to address torture. Some of these, I do think it is appropriate for us to expect the government to be able to take action on within the next year.
Thank you, Belkis, especially for laying out these very specific policy interventions, which we can sort of track and follow up going forward. We will close with Danielle.
Thank you. Well, at the outset, Mac, I want to thank you for organizing this event. It's been the first time since I've been in Iraq where we've come on a Zoom call for this type of discussion, and it's incredibly important. I want to echo that I won't repeat Belkis's concrete recommendations, but I would like to add that we stand by ready to support the government with the implementation of these concrete recommendations, which are very similar to things that we've suggested in our recent public reports. So thank you, Belkis. I just also want to reiterate how encouraged we are by the commitment of the government and recognize, yes, it is challenging, but as a community, these are issues that can be addressed and overcome. Finally, I've been looking at the participants list, and there's 62 of us here: journalists, civil society activists, academics, member states. We are, collectively, we are a human rights community, and all of us play a role in this. So don't hesitate to reach out to us, and thank you very much again for this opportunity.
Thank you to our panelists. Thank you also to our audience, both those of you who are joining now for the Zoom call, but also those of you who will view this on the AUIS YouTube channel. We just hope that you will continue to engage with IRIS going forward on this issue. Please send us any feedback whatsoever, and we'll just close there, but expect more follow-up on this issue going forward. Thanks.